So today I want to talk about stereotypes, which are probably the least controversial aspect of the Department for Education's new relationships and sex education guidance. So I think, most people can get on board with the idea that stereotypes are problematic, that they might restrict what we think that we can do, and that sort of thing. So one of the things which they do is they try to teach children about stereotypes being a problem. So children are shown, for example, they're shown videos of adults playing with a little boy that's dressed as a little girl, or a little girl that's dressed as a little boy, and they show how the adult will choose toys according to the way that the child is dressed. And so this way they give children evidence that stereotypes exist, or else they do other activities with the very small children where the children are told, put all the girl toys in one place and put all the boy toys in another place. And, and then they say to the children, why should girls play with one thing and boys play with another thing? And so gradually children are introduced to the idea that there's this really bad thing called stereotypes which exist and that we have to get rid of it. And the other thing is that also stereotypes are seen, it's not just that we're told that stereotypes restrict us, stereotypes are also seen to be the cause of all forms of, transphobic, biphobic, homophobic bullying, that, if children don't behave in a certain way, then they will become victims of this bullying. And so what they do, so children learn about these stereotypes, and then the idea is that you get rid of all stereotypes. So from very, very early ages, in nursery schools and reception and so on, teachers are instructed to avoid using gendered language. You shouldn't say girls and boys, and you should avoid having any form of gendered toys. And we're encouraged to erode sex distinctions in toys, in language, in every possible way. Now, there are a few things that I want to just say about this before I go on further. Now, first of all, when children are shown these videos, for example, this video where they see, and I'm going to put the links to these videos at the end so you can look at them yourself. So when you see, say, the woman who's playing with a little boy dressed as a girl, and she gives the child, sort of boy toys, then the message communicated is, look at how these stereotypes are enforced, and they're just so artificial. But one of the things which I would like to draw attention to is that often the reason why an adult will give a little girl dolls to play with, it's not because of stereotypes, it's because they've actually observed that little girls seem to be drawn to these toys, or little boys seem to be drawn to these toys, or they remember their own childhood. And the thing is that to some extent stereotypes exist, but to some extent they're also based on real differences, and there's a lot of evidence which shows that from really early ages, like weeks or months old, there are clear sex distinctions between boys and girls. And it's absolutely true that human nature is very malleable and flexible, and you can try and erode these distinctions. But it's also true that there are distinctions, and what we are effectively telling children is there are no differences between boys and girls. These are absolutely artificially created by the behaviour of adults, and there are no real differences. And this isn't actually true. So we're teaching children something that isn't true from a very early age. Now, but there is a more serious issue, and that is that children don't actually start properly understanding the difference understanding that they are a boy or a girl. They start understanding this around the age of 18 months to 3 years. Prior to that, they don't really understand about sex distinctions. They don't understand about that. But the way that they learn that they're a boy or a girl is by making generalizations. It's the way that human beings learn about everything. We learn that the soft furry animal is a cat by seeing lots of different cats and identifying similarities between them. And it's the same with boys and girls. We start identifying differences and working out that these are categories. And stereotypes are actually a really useful tool to help children be able to identify the difference between boys and girls. And then the next stages, so first they work out that there are boys and girls, but up until about the age of 7, sometimes even older, they think that a boy or a girl can just change their categories. So, for example, I'm going to put this video at the end. They showed a little boy a Barbie doll, and it was a boy Barbie, an action man, and then they put a wig on the boy Barbie, and the little boy thinks that now this boy Barbie is a girl because it's got a wig on. And similarly, if you get a cat and put a dog mask on it, a small child will think it's a dog. It takes a long time before they develop an idea of sex constancy, i.e. that there is a real essence of something which matches the outward appearance. But in order to develop a sense of sex constancy, they need to understand this essence, and they can only pick up on that by seeing these stereotypes and commonalities in behaviours. And what we're doing when we constantly erode stereotypes, when we try to erase distinction between boys and girls at these earliest ages, we're making it really difficult for small children to understand that they are girls and that they are boys and that these are definite categories. So what we're doing with stereotypes is actually we're starting to create gender identity problems when we erode these stereotypes. So we're actually creating the very problems which we're supposed to be helping. But actually it gets worse than that, because you've got things like, I think it's called GIRES, Gender Identity Research and Education, something or another. Anyway, I'll put the links below. But we've got these organisations which actually say, oh, look, there are children from the earliest ages who are developing these gender identity problems. Children at preschool age are developing gender identity problems, so, you must look out for this. But these are children who, in a normal course of events, are not even at an age where they properly know if they are girls or boys. So they're taking these children before they would have formed a sexed identity anyway, and they're confusing it further. So they'll take a little boy and say, oh, he thinks he's a little girl, and then they'll encourage him in this little girl identity. So they're actually furthering and deepening that identity problem. But there are lots of other things which we then go on to do. So in the normal course of events, children are now told, for example, they're told, for example, that not all, that some girls have vaginas and some boys have penises. Stonewall is actually encouraging, and I think other organisations too, to stop using he and she and refer to they and their, to further confuse this idea of male and female. It's becoming quite ubiquitous to avoid talking about mothers and fathers, or at least introduce, the idea of two dads or two mums. So Stonewall has this whole programme. Say you're doing a math sum, you'll say Ben went to the shop with his dads, or you'll talk about Shanika and Ashana getting married. And these are all, this is being sold to us as creating tolerance and avoiding homophobia. But actually what it's doing is making it really difficult for children for the youngest ages to develop any sense of sexed identity. I mean, if you think about it, ideas like mother and father, husband and wife, brother and sister, these are all the ways in which we learn that we are male and that we are female, and we are systematically trying to erode this. And having a strong sense of identity, children who have a strong sense of identity, first of all, this kind of identity, feeling you're male or female, this facilitates pro-social behaviour, because having a sense of belonging to a group has been found to encourage pro-social behaviour. And also, if you challenge a child's sense of identity, then this can actually produce depression. So that's actually a problem. But it's not only that. If you've got a strong sense of identity, I actually think you're much more able to challenge it. I know when I was a little girl, I remember it was actually around the age of 7, I noticed that all the boys were playing football and I wasn't playing football, and it was a distinction I noticed. So I went and started playing football, but I found I didn't like it very much, so I stopped. What I'm trying to say is, if you have a sense of identity, you're not restricted by it. It's actually a foundation or a cornerstone through which you can explore the world. And if children don't have this, they're much more likely to latch on to stereotypes. And I think this is part of the reason why small boys seem to be quite likely these days, or more likely perhaps than in the past, to be drawn to girly things, because because a male identity has been so eroded. There's no clear male identity because males are seen as toxic and it's seen as something shameful, whereas female identity is so clear. There's nail varnish and there's glitter and there's this and there's that, and so I think that's partly why boys get drawn to feminine things, because it provides a really clear sense of identity. And there's something else I just want to mention at this point, which is that when I've been looking at the data on stereotypes and toys and all the rest of it, it seems to me that there's a much firmer distinction between boy toys and girl toys than existed when I was a child. Sure, there was a distinction when I was a child, but it wasn't as caricatured and crude as it is today. And I think that what's happened is that we have actually been denying children, now for many decades now, we've been trying to deny sex differences. But children, I think deep within our sort of human brains, we know we're seeking these things out. So if children can't find it in the world around them, but the marketers offer them these bright pink or blue things, then they're drawn towards the sex differences that they see in toys. So I think that when we've been challenging sex differences in everyday life, we've actually strengthened the use of the children's attraction for these toys. But anyway, it gets worse than this. So what I've tried to do is explain how the process of eroding stereotypes at this early age actually threatens children developing a normal identity. But this process of disrupting identity development carries on, because children are then presented, there are all these activities that they do in school which encourage this very firm idea, of boy things and girl things, and then the teachers say, well, why should there be these strict categories? And it's a kind of, on one hand, they're eroding the natural differences, but they're encouraging these caricatured differences. And I'll put a link to the Mermaids caricature at the end, where they have this kind of action man at one end and Barbie at another end. And the children think, well, they can't possibly identify with that male or female because it's presented to them in such a caricatured form. So then they're given these really rigid stereotypes which they can't identify with, and then they start thinking, well, no, I don't identify with male or female. I am one of those children who's got this gender identity problem. So again, these rigid categories are creating the very problem. And then they're given things like the gender unicorn or the genderbread person, I think even at the age of 7. And this is just like this crazy thing where they're told that there's a difference between gender, it's gender identity, gender expression, and gender, how your gender is ascribed, and then who you're attracted to. And I mean, I completely struggle with this, and you're giving it to a 7, 8, 9-year-old child to make all these distinctions, and their children are taught that gender, sex is ascribed, that whether their physicality, whether they have a penis or a vagina, is just completely irrelevant. So you can just imagine, just as this child has developed at about the age of 7, developed a sense of sex constancy despite all the hurdles which our education system is putting in their way. Say they do manage to develop a sense of sex constancy, they're then given this gender unicorn, which is fragmenting their identity into smithereens, where your physicality is separated from who you're attracted to. What does who you're attracted to mean when you're 9 years old, or let alone 7 years old, which is fragmented from gender expression. So we've got this whole education system which is just bashing up, preventing children developing their identities. And then finally, when they get to their teenage years, they're then offered, and this has been pretty constant, and I'll put links to some of these materials so you can see what I mean, because there are a lot of other things. I'll just, before I go on to, so for example, they're given videos where they've got, a young woman or a young girl, let's say a young woman who's decided that she's a young boy, and then they'll have a young man who's decided that he's a young woman, and you actually have huge difficulty working out, was this a boy or was this a girl? And these people speak to the children, and this just absolutely blasts idea of boy and girl, just blasts it away. So, and there are lots of things like this. So you've got your regular child who's had their sexed identity absolutely fragmented by an education system which is set up by this relationships and sex. It's reinforced, it's created, it's going to be absolutely embedded by the relationships and sex education program, which is being introduced very shortly. And then they're told, well, if you do have a problem, here are all these organisations that you can go to. So they are then made to feel validated and reinforced if they adopt this alternative identity. Being the normal sort of heterosexual identity, it's given a special term, cisgender, and it's given one of many different identities to choose from. But cisgender, which just means being normal, is completely downplayed, and I know that people reject my saying being normal, but quite honestly, I don't think there's any problem with not being normal. It's just, but there is a normal and there is a not normal. So if they choose one of these alternatives, then they'll be given counselling and all kinds of things. They'll get loads of attention. So your fragmented identity is suddenly majorly reinforced, which makes being gender dysphoric or being transgender or genderqueer or whatever label you want to adopt much more attractive, because you'll be reinforced. And then you are actually, by a number of these organisations, actively encouraged to have hormone therapy. And when I say actively encouraged, what I mean is that if a child has these identity problems, the best solution would actually be to have some counselling or therapy. But if you look at some of the information on the Proud Trust, it just sort of says, well, you can get medical help. But what they don't tell you, they tell children, well, if you're uncertain, you just take these hormone blockers, and as soon as you're certain again, you can stop these hormone blockers. But these hormone blockers significantly change your physical development. We actually don't know too much about their effect. We know more about their impact on sheep than we do about their impact on humans. But we know that they do arrest development. So, for example, a boy who wants to decides that he wants to try to become a girl, if he has gone on these hormone blockers early on, he'll actually find that his penis hasn't developed sufficiently to for there to be enough skin to even make a vagina. So it's not only that it affects his development in terms of his brain development and his bone development, but then he's not even got a body that they can do this sort of sex change thing on. So the whole thing is really devastating for children, and I think the message that I want to get across is that this is not about, you know, I think many people are falling for this because they think it's just about making gay people, you know, feel comfortable, or transgender people feel comfortable, but it's not. It's about changing the whole family structure and the whole way in which we view society. And it's in ways which we haven't consented to. It's a minority of people, you know, that are doing this, and they do have their own agenda. You know, I think that the agenda is that people who are LGBT, you know, they want to feel that there's absolutely no difference between being gay or straight or anything like that, and there's been a big push that the whole transgender thing is, in a way, it's a recruitment exercise. I'll give you an example of this just briefly before I finish. So Stonewall will tell you that 49% of LGBT children have suffered from some form of bullying, but you'll find out that 49% of those LGBT children, that 64% of that 49% were actually trans. So the whole trans lot greatly increases the number of LGBT. It increases their numbers, so they've got sort of more campaigning power. And what effectively is happening is that these organisations are recruiting our children from, you know, 2 or 3 years old to support their campaign. This is what it's really all about. It's not about overcoming homophobia. It's about recruiting our children to their political campaign, and we need to start understanding that this is a political issue. This is about changing the family, changing the way we understand male and female, changing the way we understand marriage. It's about changing the most intimate aspects of our life, and this is being done without our consent. So I think that's what I really want to communicate, that this is a political campaign and our children are being recruited as their foot soldiers, and that we need to put a stop to this. Thank you.